Secretary Lew, you've said again today the President won't negotiate on a debt limit. And the President, as was noted earlier, has asserted that there haven't been additional items added to debt limits in the past. And as you and I have talked about, and as you know, when you look back at the last 30 years of the history of debt limits, it's the only thing that has worked. In fact, every significant deficit reduction package that has passed this Congress in the last 30 years has come in the context of a debt limit. I found one that didn't. It was in 2005 for about $40 billion, a relatively small deal. That's the way it's worked. And it's Graham Rudman. It's the 1990 Balanced Budget Agreement, or the Andrews Air Force Base Agreement. It's the 1997 Balanced Budget Agreement. It's PAYGO rules that many in this committee on the other side of the aisle talk about favorably. Of course, it's the most recent Budget Control Act just a couple of years ago, all in the context of the debt limit. So my view is kind of strange the President would, one, not want to negotiate, but two, say we haven't added stuff. It's all that has worked to deal with this. And you indicated this earlier, it only makes common sense because it's a tough vote, as you said. Why? Because our constituents don't get it. You know, why would you extend the credit card again, go over the limit again without dealing with the underlying problem? And that's why, you know, the polling shows that by over 2 to 1, the American people say, yeah, we should extend the debt limit, but only if we deal with the underlying problem. And that's all we're asking for. I'm speaking for myself, I will say we need to avoid a debt limit crisis, but we also need to avoid a debt crisis. So avoiding a debt limit crisis today and avoiding a debt crisis tomorrow should be our objective. The President himself said back in 2006, when the debt was half as big as it is today, $8 trillion, and this was a floor speech, America has a debt problem and a failure of leadership. He said, I'm therefore going to oppose the increase in the debt limit. He opposed it when it was half as big as it was today. He said we needed to deal with the underlying problem. And in response to Senator Hatch's question earlier about why the President refuses to deal with the underlying problem, which we all know is the 2/3 of the spending and the biggest part of the spending and the fastest growing part of the spending that is on autopilot, that we don't appropriate every year, which is the mandatory side. In response to that question, you said, and I quote, he put in his budget significant entitlement spending reforms. He wants to do this. And in fact, you're right. The President's proposal includes a pretty long list of entitlement savings, mandatory savings, adds up to about $730 billion over 10 years, step in the right direction. During that time, by the way, we're likely to add another $8 trillion to the debt based on the CBO, Congressional Budget Office. But he's got $730 billion over 10 years. Now, not all those choices reflect my top priorities or others on this committee probably. But in a negotiation, you don't get everything you want. So my question to you today is really very simple. By adding some of those proposals, maybe not all $730 billion, maybe it's $500 billion, maybe it's $400 billion, but by adding some of the President's own proposals to an extension of the debt limit, consistent with what's been done historically and consistent with what the American people are asking for, couldn't we move forward? And isn't that what we ought to be doing? Dealing, yes, with the debt limit, but also with the underlying problem, and taking the President's own proposals to do it.
Senator, on the history of the debt limit, you and I have been back and forth many times. I think it makes a big difference if you tack a debt limit increase onto something that's already been agreed to. In 1997, the Balanced Budget Agreement was all signed and sealed, and then a debt limit increase was put into it. It didn't drive it. Nobody threatened default. So I think we're in a different situation since 2011. And that has changed.
Nobody threatened default because you never had a president saying he wouldn't negotiate.
And the President has said, and it's just repeated this week, he wants to and is prepared to negotiate. I think it's important not to just go through a president's budget and cherry pick the things that are hard for him to do. You have to look at the things that are hard for others to do, because the negotiation is give and take. If everything is on the table, if we're looking at entitlement reform and tax reform in a way that join together to solve the problem, there could be a serious conversation. But I just would caution to just not take one side of the ledger.
Because the President also says in that budget that he believes we ought to have tax reform. And specifically with regard to corporate tax reform, for the first time in your budget, you indicated it should be revenue neutral. And I applaud you for that, as you know. I think that's important. I think it's an urgency right now. If we don't deal with it, we're going to continue to lose more jobs in this country. My question to you would be, the President's own proposals on entitlements. I agree there should be a give and take, but I'm willing to say let's look at the President's own proposals, putting those into this debt limit increase, plus directions to the Congress on tax reform, as you all have suggested. Would you all be willing to move that forward?
Well, just to be clear, the President's view on the debt limit he has stated as clearly as he can. He's not negotiating over the debt limit. The debt limit, Congress has to make it possible to pay our bills. He
Senator
looks
Bennett.
forward to
Senator
negotiating.
Bennett, you're next. Senator Bennett.